Hello everybody, welcome to our session on future-proofing household surveys. My name is Sarah Martin, I'm Head of Surveys at the Scottish Government. For a bit of context, our household surveys form a multi-million-pound investment annually, and together with the less frequent census form the statistical backbone that is used right across the public, private, third sector and academia for policy design, research and benchmarking of smaller collections. They primarily collect information that will never be a byproduct of other sources, as people call it, such as big data. Do you remember big data? Indeed, and who has it? Our surveys ask about people's lived experience, for example, in crime surveys, behaviour, for example, in health surveys, and attitudes and views, for example, about services. Further demographic questions enable us to identify, for example, who the underserved are in our society and what their often complex needs are. However, as people are increasingly bombarded with customer satisfaction surveys, they are less and less likely to take the time to invite an interviewer into their home for a lengthy interview in their precious spare time. And Linda just gave a nice presentation about that just earlier. Decreasing response casts doubts on quality, and the expectation in times of austerity was that costs ought to be reducing rather than increasing with wages and incentives. Since the people we ought to be most interested in are among those who can't respond online for various reasons, and the jury's still out on the data quality of online surveys, we're glad that ONS and NISRA are pioneering this work very carefully, as discussed in the session this morning and just earlier on. But in this session, we will introduce you to the programme of work outside ONS and the devolved administrations to ensure that our data collections are fit for purpose and deliver public value into the future. As you will see, this is quite a diverse and often complex set of methods, topics and applications. We have come a long way in some respects, but the pressures will persist and evolve. So in the fourth part of this session, after the talks, we will leverage your expertise as our newly engaged government advisors to critique our work to date and look to what the future will require of us. So please, during the talks, if you note any questions, particularly surprises, comments and suggestions you have using the technology provided or any other you have brought with you, and we will discuss these in small groups afterwards. But for now, I would like to introduce you to Ben Cook, who leads on survey methodology at the Scottish Government, followed by Steve Marshall, Chief Researcher at the Welsh Government, and last but not least, Kevin Sweeney, Head of Social Survey Division at the Northern Ireland Statistics and Research Agency. They will each introduce quite a different aspect and their approach to future-proofing, and I'll leave you with that.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, so as Sarah said, I'm going to carry on the Caledonian theme for the past hour or so in this room at least. So I'm going to talk about the population surveys in Scotland and what we call the Scottish Survey's core questions, SSCQ. So I'll introduce what our population surveys are in Scotland, and then go on to the core questions about harmonisation of our questions, the sampling and the weighting for our surveys very briefly, and then the analysis that we can do of this. And then finally talk about where we're going in the future with our strategy and how we're going to look to improve our surveys going forward. So in Scotland, we have something called the National Performance Framework. And this is a set of ambitions of how we would like Scotland to look now and in the future. And this is not only a Scottish Government product, this is a product across the public sector in Scotland more in general and owned by the Scottish public. So this is about how Scotland should be for everyone living in Scotland. So underneath our framework, we have these various national ambitions, and underpinning those, we have national outcomes and indicators to measure them. So we're very accountable to the public in Scotland on how we're doing on these indicators. Now, whereas some of these indicators can be very directly measurable from admin data, say the number of businesses that are registered, a lot of these measures and ambitions relate to how people feel, how their satisfaction with services, and how they're feeling about their surroundings. And these aren't things that we can measure directly from admin data. So we need to go out and ask people about their own experiences. And this is where social surveys, population surveys, really come in useful for us. So I'm going to talk about 3 surveys mainly in Scotland, and they are the Scottish Household Survey, that Linda gave a presentation on earlier, the Crime and Justice Survey, and the Health Survey. And these are all surveys which are delivered face-to-face and delivered on random sample selections. So we go to someone's house that's been randomly selected, an interviewer knocks on the door, and they spend 45 minutes to an hour asking people questions in these topics. So the household survey is very much Scotland's general household population survey, asking about a huge range of things, including travel, perception of local government, participation in cultural activities. The health survey, pretty self-explanatory. And the Crime and Justice Survey not only asks about people's crime that they haven't reported to the police, so differs from published crime statistics, but also asks about fairness and justice and equality across Scotland. So, up until 2011, we had 4 different separate surveys running in Scotland. We had Household Survey, House Condition Survey, Crime and Justice Survey, and Health Survey. And these all had slightly different sampling methods, slightly different weighting methods, and where they ask similar questions, they might be asked in a slightly different way to each other. So that meant that all that could be analysed was these surveys separately from each other. So the House Condition Survey now forms part of the Household Survey, but we've pulled together the responses from these 3 surveys in terms of we've now got questions that are the same, or at least can be analysed in the same way in each of these surveys. So there's around 20 questions at the moment, which are being asked in the same or a very similar way in each of these surveys. And we brought in-house the sampling and weighting methodologies for these surveys. So this now means that instead of having a maximum 10,000 respondents in the household survey, we can also include the 6,000 in the Crime and Justice Survey, 4,000 in the Health Survey, to create a pooled sample every year of 20,000 responses for our 20 key questions. And this allows us to delve down into smaller groups of the population and produce statistics and comparisons for these groups. And this is really important also for the National Performance Framework, because that's not just about national, that's about how those ambitions relate to equalities groups that protect equalities that we have in law, and how those ambitions are different for not different ambitions, but how we are differently measuring those ambitions for those groups. So this forming of the core was envisaged by a long-term survey strategy, a previous version of this, and last year we updated to the 2018 strategy, and I'm going to finish this presentation with a bit of how we're implementing that strategy going forward. So the core really allows us to benefit from these small groups of the population, producing confidence statistics for those. So not only can we produce accurate statistics for fairly small parts of the population, so they're less than 2% of people in Scotland who identify as being Muslim, we can also break these down into the characteristics of these people. So we can produce things like population pyramids for these groups, the shaded block representing each religious group. So this one down here is the Muslim group in comparison to those who are Church of Scotland, and the sort of hollow boxes are how that compares to Scotland's population structure in general. But it's not only those demographic characteristics, we can do this for health measures, we can do this for people's perception of crime and policing. Anything that's in the core we can look at in comparison to anything else. So we've also taken this a step further in analysis. Every year, the core, the 20,000 respondents, allows us to produce statistics for the 32 council areas in Scotland. But if we pool together 4 years' worth of this data, we can start to look at even smaller areas and produce direct statistics for those, creating an 80,000 person sample. So, for a single year, you're looking at 32 subdivisions of Scotland. So this is adapted from a presentation we give at Edinburgh Zoo, which is why we're focusing on that area. If we combine 2 years worth of data, we have 40,000 respondents. So we can produce statistics at parliamentary level, and that is 70 subdivisions of Scotland. And once we combine 4 years worth of data, we can produce statistics on electoral ward level, which is 350 subdivisions of Scotland. So that's a bit of an overview of the core and the population surveys in Scotland. So I'm now going to touch on creating that core, the difficulties or not of doing so. So this is a set of the questions that were included in the core up to 2017. And you'll see there's a lot about demographic information on diversity groups, so things like ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, some key health measures, and some measures to do with perception of crime in the local area and perceptions of the police. From 2018, we're also going to be reporting on local government satisfaction. So we find that when we ask these questions of 3 separate surveys, so there's crime and justice survey, health survey, household survey, if we had a random sample from each of those 3 surveys, we should expect that the proportion of people saying yes to certain questions would be very similar, or at least within survey confidence levels. So that works very well for things like demographic information, for the protected characteristics, and for simple questions such as smoking. So you'll see that all 3 separate surveys there are very close to each other in terms of the proportion they're estimating of people who smoke. But some questions don't work as well. And that is, we often think that due to either the placement of the question in the questionnaire or it being related to the subject that's been asked more generally. So here we have, do you provide unpaid care? So that's caring for people with either due to their age or people with a disability that you're not paid for. And we see that for the household survey, the bottom estimate, it's a higher proportion of people who say that. And we think that might be to do with it being asked alongside volunteering questions in the household survey. I'll just say it's not massively different, but there is clearly still a difference. And we also find this with a long-term health condition. And this example here is the health survey reports a higher level of people with a long-term condition. And if we look at the questions that are being asked in each of the surveys, although we can do the same amount of analysis, the health survey question goes into detail about which conditions you have, because that's needed for the analysis for the health survey. Whereas the household and the crime and justice survey only ask, do you have a condition? So we find that when asking these additional questions about specific conditions, people are more likely to report that they have one of these. So I'm going to very briefly touch on sampling and weighting, but people are very welcome to ask more questions afterwards. So all of our sampling for our household surveys comes from the postcode address file. So that's a list of households that Royal Mail deliver to. And from 2012 onwards, this has been centralised in one team. And this means that rather than previously people would potentially, due to randomness, get multiple questionnaires a year or get them in consecutive years, it now means we can stop people getting questionnaires within a 4-year period. So if you stayed at the same household, you're only ever going to get one of our 3 surveys every 4 years. And we choose 4 years because we pool together 4 years for our core. So we keep that independence of our sample. But again, this isn't as straightforward as it might seem, because each of the 3 surveys has its own sample design. And we still need to meet the criteria of each of those surveys as well as our core design. So just for example, the health survey has a clustered design because a nurse goes and visits individuals to take biological measurements. And the household survey is aiming to report at local authority level every year, whereas the other 2 surveys aren't. So we need to be mindful of all these different constraints when we're conducting our sampling for the core. So for our weighting, we generally follow a sort of two-stage process for each individual survey. So part 1 of that is to account for unequal probabilities of selection. So as we want to report for each council area in Scotland, we need a sufficient sample size to be able to do that, to create an accurate result to get enough precision in our estimates for each council. Some councils in Scotland are fairly small, like the Shetland Islands off the north coast, and some islands are a bit bigger. Renfrewshire, which is southwest of Glasgow, main town is sort of Paisley, if you know Scotland. And roughly here, Renfrewshire is about 8 times as big, but we're taking a very similar sample size from both to get that precision. So we need to adjust our weights when we create our national estimates to account for this difference. We then run calibration to adjust our estimates up for some sort of non-response. It's not true non-response weighting because we're using a household sampling frame, but we account for some form of non-response by adjusting up our younger people who are less likely to respond and adjusting down those older people who are more likely to respond to our surveys, we found. Now, that's fine for each individual survey, but when it comes to the core, if we just took those weights, we'd effectively have a survey that was weighted by 3 times the population of Scotland. And due to the uneven nature of the proportions of the sample in each survey, we need to do an additional step to create our core weights before we calibrate again. And what we do is use the net effective sample size from each survey to adjust our individual survey weights before we recalibrate. And I'm not going to mention any more because that gets very technical very quick. But you can ask lots of questions. So I'll just run on to some of the analysis from the core and then talk about what we're doing moving forward. So a big report that we produced from the core was on sexual orientation in Scotland. Due to the bigger sample size, we can look at how the lesbian, gay, bisexual and other sexual orientation reporting group differ from those reporting as heterosexual. And this was published in January 2017. And we can look at how the health for those different groups of people and their labour market status is. So we find that LGBTO adults were more likely to be unemployed, they were more likely to live in large urban areas, and they were more likely to live in deprived data zones based on Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. So that doesn't necessarily imply they were more deprived, they just lived in areas that were more deprived. But that's really the power of the core, that we can delve into small groups of population and look at inequality across Scotland. We've also been able to look at delving deeper into confidence in the ability of the police. And here we ran a latent class analysis on our results to look at what type of people were responding to these questions in a very positive way as opposed to a negative way. So we asked 6 questions about different aspects of how the police respond to people's queries and incidents. And we found that these, in our latent class analysis, basically broke down into 4 groups: those who always respond highly, those who consider the police very good at resolution, those who consider the police very good at response, and those who had very low confidence in the police, full stop. But I'll just point out that overall, over 50% of people said they weren't confident in each of the categories. And then we can do this analysis at local authority area as well, which wouldn't be available to do from the Crime and Justice Survey alone in a single year. So, just as an aside, all the data is on statistics.gov.scot, so it's a shameless plug for the website, which is Scotland's open data platform, which holds a lot of public sector data for Scotland, and you can access that in a very using open data, 5-star open data type procedures. So I said to come back to the long-term service strategy and what we're doing for the future of our surveys. So we published an updated strategy last year, 2018, and you can see our key themes for what we want to do with our surveys going forward. And we've already started some work on this. So, as well as working with Ipsos Mori in the previous presentation to look at how estimates from our surveys differ if we change our survey strategies. We're also looking at who our respondents are, how they differ, if they're harder to reach, if they take more effort to reach, as opposed to being very easy and answer on the first time someone knocks on the door. We're looking at data linkage opportunities. So we're looking at, can we replace some questions in our survey with admin data? Can we use admin data to improve our survey frames? And we're also looking at local users. So can we use small area estimation techniques instead of our direct 4-year estimates to mean that we can produce either lower level estimates or to produce those estimates every year rather than every 4 years. So that's basically how we want to move forward in implementing our long-term survey strategy. So I realise that was a very quick overview of Scottish population surveys, but I'm going to now question with Sarah whether she wants questions now or whether we're going to move on.
So, any clarification questions for Ben while he multitasks, loads up Steve's talk, and gets that up online.
Hi, I'm from NHS Scotland, so it was really interesting hearing the talks. Can you tell us, when you were talking about sexual orientation, so there's obviously a big drive to get more and more data about kind of equality and inclusion and such like, so how do you cope with non-response if people would prefer not to disclose that, kind of what happens?
Sorry, your question was coping with non-response.
Yes, so for things like
sexual
sexual orientation, as an example, people would respond that they prefer not to say, kind of how do you factor that into your calculations?
So at the moment, we're presuming that there's no relationship with other variables in a way because our weighting only accounts for sort of normal demographic characteristics. We ask people to say if one of the various sexual orientation categories, and then we either prefer not to say, and we report the proportions over time that say prefer not to say. So rather than for adjusting that, we just make it clear to people there is this proportion of people who have answered prefer not to say or don't know refused.
So we'll take we'll have time for discussion later on. So I'm quite keen to get through the talks.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about what we've been doing in Wales around our social surveys. What we've ended up with is an integrated household survey, and what I will do is basically talk a bit about why we ended up in that direction. Most of the detail will be around how we got there, the sorts of things we were looking into to make sure when we were doing it, we ended up with something workable. And then I'll cover a little bit about the benefits, since we've actually been running that for a while now. So why were we heading in this direction? I guess one of the big drivers was pressure on budgets. We were starting to think about our next round of procurement for our surveys a few years into austerity. Our sponsored bodies who ran largest surveys were under even more pressure than us. But we're also having other issues, particularly around response rates. And sometimes when we would have two big surveys in the field at the same time, when they're not continuous, it would hit on the response rate of each one, because we do struggle in Wales with the capacity of the field force available, whoever is actually delivering it for us. And it's particularly an issue on surveys because there is such a big proportion of our total social research spending. Each one is millions of pounds, and the collection of everything else adds up to millions, but they stand out as being very big. I mean, it's clear that no change was not an option. We needed to do something, but there was still a need for good quality survey data, so we had to deliver something that would achieve savings, good value for money, but not compromise the robustness of the results. These are the surveys that we were considering. So the first two are Welsh Government surveys, our national survey, which covers a wide range of largely subjective measures, the Welsh Health Survey, plus 3 surveys from our sponsored bodies, who were, as I say, having similar issues that we had, but in their case, probably having a greater impact in that their analytical capacity was quite minimal, so their ability to kind of respond to issues was even less. So what we did, and I had some discussions with ministers, set out the issues, and a plan to basically review, effectively with a blank sheet of paper and say, well, what on earth can we do to deliver what we need in a sustainable way? So we commissioned an independent review. The full report is there. I'm not sure if you'll get access to the slides later, but if you do want copies of any of the reports I highlight, I'll tell you my email address at the end and you can always get in touch with me. So that review identified 3 basic options. One is we use cheaper modes, and they're definitely lower cost, but at the time we were doing it, very early days in terms of web collection, all of those options would give less robust results. We could simply do less, reduce sample size, frequency of collection, the amount of data we collect, and that's definitely lower cost, but you get less, and we're looking for good quality results, not just saving money by not getting as much stuff. So the third option is bring these surveys together in some way, and that has options to reduce the cost, but still, if you get the design right, good quality, timely data and detailed results. So that's the option that we decided on, but there are a number of different ways of looking at that. Basically, there were 2 broad choices, looking at overlapping modules or a new single survey. So this is a slide that Maury produced, who were the independent reviewers, as part of the stakeholder discussions when we were developing options involving our stakeholders, the sponsored bodies, the key users. So essentially a new survey would be, well, you put it all together in one survey and you get the issue that potentially makes the questionnaire quite long, so you need to think about how you manage that, but it does have the advantage of allowing you to analyse across a lot of topics that were previously completely separate surveys. The other option would be to fix something around a demographic core and the 2 main Welsh Government surveys and add in the others as modules, but with overlapping. So you wouldn't increase the length of the questionnaire, but you would have to increase the number of interviews to fit those in, which gave us 2 real issues. One I've already highlighted, that we were already worried about the capacity of the field force in Wales to deliver our existing surveys. Making something even bigger just looks really risky right from the outset. So we were really concerned with going down that sort of route. It also then reduces the ability to analyse across different topics, because Module X, say if that was sport, you'd only be able to analyse a limited amount of the sports questions against the health questions, or alternatively, some against the national survey questions. So I think I've said all that one. So we decided to go basically with a completely new survey and integrating all the questions and going a bit further than that previous slide suggests. We weren't just stitching together lots of previous surveys and maybe adjusting some things that we wouldn't ask anymore to fit things in. We decided to take all the requirements of those surveys and build a new survey. So you've got the demographics, you've got a number of core questions that all surveys will include for analysis, things like educational qualifications, economic activities and things around subjective well-being. And then fit the rest of the questions in a way that makes sense as a new survey. We would potentially subsample within that, which is one way to achieve keeping more content but saving time. So that would be in cases where we only need a national level figure, we do limited amounts of subgroup analysis. Another way that we would then keep control of maximising the content by keeping the questionnaire as short as possible is to switch things in and out across years. So for instance, there were a lot of measures collected in the health survey that haven't changed for decades. And we certainly had pushback from our health minister, why on earth are we spending all this money collecting something that has never changed? So we had to assess the questions to say, well, how stable is this? Can we ask it every other year or every 3 years? And that's a way of trying to fit more into the questionnaire. So just a summary of the design that we ended up with. So it would be an annual achieved sample of 12,000. It would be a random selection, again from the postcode address file. It would be a 45-minute interview. Basically, we decided on what we thought we could get away with in terms of how long it would be and how would we fit things in there rather than the other way around. It would be face-to-face interviews, with one randomly selected adult within each household, and we're expecting around 60 to 65% response rate. I guess a couple of things to mention based on the last presentation. In terms of local authorities, we had a sample size proportional to the population of each local authority, but setting a minimum. We don't have some quite as small as those in Scotland, but still some of our local authorities are quite small, so we did have a lower limit. Plus, we also need to deliver on health boards, and Powys, one of our local authorities, is also health board limit, so we had to have an increased sample there. What we've decided is the health survey used to do something similar as described in the last talk about putting together about 9 years of data to do small area figures. We'd already done some work around small area estimation, and we were basically saying as part of this design that we wouldn't produce smaller areas by aggregating across years, we'd do that by small area estimation. So just going back to those 5 surveys, as you can see from the last column, similar sorts of issues as Scotland is they're all a bit different. You've got different modes, you've got face-to-face, you've got some self-completion, you've got telephone, very different sorts of response rates and different ways of delivering. We need to take all that into account in terms of, 1, how we bring it together into a sensible design, and 2, the impacts on things like continuity of estimates. So the first thing we had to do, because we were bringing together 5 surveys that were funded with 5 separate budgets, is who gets what in this new survey. So that's basically analysing all 5 and saying, well, probably didn't notice on the previous slide actually that some of the sponsored body surveys wouldn't be asked every year, it'd be every 2 years, 3 years, one every 5 years. So we need to come up with a 5 or 6 year footprint and say, well, what does your proportional share look like? Based on taking the same sort of volume cut in what we're going to get, and then how many minutes would that give you within each year? Which then we could give each sponsored body, this is how much it's going to cost you. Now there's one benefit straight off in that the Arts Council would do a survey every 3 to 5 years, and they suddenly have to find a load of money every now and again. What we say to them is give us 30,000 a year, and you don't need to worry how many minutes you get in the particular year. So you can vary it as long as you stay within your overall footprint across the entire contract. The other benefit is if you look at Sport Wales on here, they would have asked a full survey every 2 years. What they decided to do as part of their footprint, which is an average 3.5 minutes per year, is to split that such that every year they get 2 minutes, and then every 3 years they would ask more detail. They could never do that if they were just doing their own survey. It would just cost a bonkers amount to do a 2-minute survey every year. So you can immediately see some benefits in terms of doing this. So once we've got that, we could start bringing together a draft questionnaire. And as part of doing that, we had to think about what on earth we're going to take out, what we're going to ask less often, what can we subsample. But also the similar sorts of issues that just highlighted previously around, well, all these surveys sometimes ask the same sorts of things slightly different ways, or they've got topics that might cause context effects when you actually merge them together, and we need to start thinking about how this affects the design of the questionnaire in the end outputs. So we drafted something based on what we think it could look like, and the first thing we did is a consultation, which we were required to do because 3 of the surveys were national statistics. Also, it's something we want to do anyway, because we need to test what we're doing with the people who are going to use the data, as well as the 4 bodies. So as part of that consultation, we were trying to get a feel for what people thought about the approach, what sort of things we could take out, what things we could do less often, that sort of thing. We didn't get a lot of response, but the key stakeholders, basically they were in favour of it, and the kind of questionnaire that we designed didn't really have an awful lot of issues. The next thing we did was to commission a systematic review, to take what we'd done to kind of do a desk review to really understand whether there were going to be context effects, whether we'd use the best sorts of question, because we might have taken a question from a telephone survey, all those sorts of things. Lots of detailed work, I won't run through those. But there is a report on the website, and it did look in detail at things like whether it should be interview-led or self-completion via computer. We took the results of that then to do a large-scale field test, which was like a full quarter of the previous national survey, to try and get some accurate timings to see if operationally it just worked. Get some testing around this issue about what things can be asked by CACI and which can be self-completion, and try and understand where there might possibly be some discontinuities. The key thing from that is actually it worked. They successfully delivered something which was good. The response rates were coming out as reasonable, and we got some solid data to then go on to the next stage, which is to develop a specification to go out to contract. That's been running since 2016-17. Response rates a bit lower than we were hoping for, but not that much, and now the contract's settling in and it's creeping up. It's getting towards 60%, which is something that we're quite happy with, and we haven't had any other issues in terms of how it's been working. So in terms of benefits, we've got 3 years of data, and it's been used heavily, and no complaints at all so far from our users, so it's clearly helping to deliver for Wales. We've saved around 1.3 million a year by doing this. The current contract is around 2 million, so that's quite high proportionate saving. As I mentioned before, budget predictability annually for sponsored bodies. We don't have those clashes in the field. Decent response rates, and as I mentioned with the Sport Wales example, a lot more opportunity for the sponsored bodies to have flexibility of what they get when, and they can change it year by year as long as it fits in with every other demand. Now the approach is based on our previous national survey, which we've kept the name because there was a lot of public understanding of that. But having the flexibility of being able to respond to policy demands and user demands is really important. To be able to switch questions in and out, to subsample, to give us the flexibility to put new questions in when we need to meet emerging demands. And that's been working very successfully. It's brought a lot more topics together in terms of being able to do analysis. And we've focused a lot more in our outputs around not just presenting cross-tabulation, but doing regression analysis, which means you've got a lot more factors to bring in. And we're starting to look at doing things like latent class analysis in terms of being able to give people a much better picture rather than saying the numbers 23%. What does this all really mean? A bit like the Scottish example, this survey is key to our National Performance Framework, which is the Wellbeing Future Generations Act, and a third of the indicators are from that. And if you're interested in that, I did a presentation a couple of months ago, which there's a link to there. So just a couple of concluding comments. I think the success has been down to the fact that we manage this centrally in Welsh Government, all the budgets are brought together, and we make the controls around the quality of the questions that go in, and the fact that we completely designed from scratch the survey rather than trying to stitch them together. It has meant some loss of autonomy for some of the sponsor bodies, but they get a lot of benefits, both financial and non-financial. It was a huge change, but 3 years in, you can really see that it's a benefit. We expect to continue with this approach for about the next 7 years, which will be through our next contract period, but we're watching with great interest with what the ONS do around web development. We don't really have the capacity to do our own, so we want to see what is possible and actually see it working, and then see where we end up. But that's kind of where we're at. My email address is actually now steve.marshall@gov.wales, so if you do want to ask for any links, if you can't get this, then just give me an email.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Okay, interesting actually to reflect on what people have said and how many ideas we've stolen from other places, particularly Scotland. But what I'm going to try and do is just give you a little background to how surveys are organised in Northern Ireland. A couple of things I want to just touch on, and that's our experience of doing an online census test, something about response rates, and where we think we need to go in the future. So let me start just by just a little bit about how we as a unit are organised. So we're there, we provide a survey research service to government, a little bit to the wider public sector. We focus on high quality probability surveys, and we provide a complete service if we're asked for it. And we also collaborate with ONS and NatSen. We're a small but well integrated, we like to think, unit. We're all in the same room, so it's hard not to be integrated. And of course, it's about 50 staff in total, and of course, it's all built on the foundation of our field force. So we have about 300 interviewers who do our field work for us. Just a little bit about the history. We exist because way back in '67, somebody introduced the Family Expenditure Survey to Northern Ireland, 10 years after it had been started in the rest of the UK. And you can see there we've gradually built up a portfolio of surveys, particularly during the 90s and in 2000s, when there's essentially an expansion of the evidence base, because we didn't have a lot of social statistics on Northern Ireland. We introduced, or the International Passenger Survey was extended to Northern Ireland in 2010, and we started a Northern Ireland Passenger Survey to reflect the volume and value of tourism in Northern Ireland. That covers all the ports and airports. I don't know whether anybody was picked up on their way in or their way out. You might be. Our current survey programme, not only do we do our own what we call Northern Ireland National Surveys, but we provide the fieldwork capacity for ONS and to some extent NatSen in Northern Ireland to do things like the labour force survey and the UK living cost and food survey. I just thought, since I've been around a long time, I go back nearly as far as this slide, not quite. In terms of the volume of work that we were doing, we're sort of bumping along in the 70s with a biannual labour force survey. We introduced the continuous household survey, the LFS went annual, we extended social attitudes in Northern Ireland, and then about 1991 we converted our whole operation to computer-assisted interviewing. So people were asking, why are all those old machines sitting there at the back? Since we have them, we thought we'd just bring them along, and you can see what our history of computer-assisted interviewing was. And look what happened. The volume of work shot up, not really because of CAPI, but CAPI, we couldn't have done it without CAPI. There are also a couple of peaks there when we did a disability survey and the International Survey of Adult Skills. So when we got to something like 50,000 addresses sampled annually, that's about 6% of the population of Northern Ireland. That's a very high sampling proportion. And then the recession and austerity hit, and we found the demand for surveys went down. But then we copied something from Scotland, and that was your National Performance Framework. That's it. I just get confused because we call it a programme for government, even though we don't have a government. We still have a programme for government. So it has got 12 high-level strategic outcomes, and each of those are supported by a number of statistical indicators, and 22 out of those 49 indicators are based on survey data. That really reinvigorated the demand for surveys, some of which are some of our core surveys and some are commission surveys. All of those indicators are technically assessed, and some of the recommendations were that the precision of the indicators was not adequate to reflect the sort of change that people were expecting. So we then saw a boost in the sample sizes of 3 of our surveys. The sample size for the LFS and CHS was doubled, so we're back up to close to 50,000. A little bit about how we sample. So I said at that level, we're nearly 6% of the addresses. We use a NISRA address register, and I'll say a little bit about that later as our sampling frame. And all of our samples are based on our own clustered systematic random samples. Basically because Northern Ireland is predominantly a rural area, those are the population density figures. And so our interviewers are very much located close to the population centres, and we keep them all working within about 15 to 20 miles of their home address, so that minimises our travel costs. Just something very quickly about the interviewers. We have about 300. We recruit, train and manage them. They're on non-guaranteed hours contracts, and we have some performance-related payments. They are predominantly over the age of 55, and almost equally male and female, which is a big change actually from, if you go back to the start, it was predominantly a female occupation. And because we've been recruiting a lot recently, many of them have less than 5 years, our current interviewers have less than 5-year service. I just want to reflect quickly on an online data collection exercise. We did a test of the census in 2017. Everybody's aware that the 2021 census will be predominantly online or online first. We had Andrew McCormick, who's there, and his team built an online data collection system essentially from the ground up in 2017. It's a 15,000 address sample. We had a split sample because we were testing out the location of some questions in the questionnaire, so we had 2 different samples. It was pushed to web, and we were trying to use some of the innovative work that ONS were talking about this morning in terms of getting response. We got overall a 40% response rate, but that was really because it was a very restricted time period. But we got 60% completed online, and it all worked fine. Somewhat to Andrew's surprise. No, it was a great system. But one of the things actually is that's the hits on, or that's the people accessing the online questionnaire. 2 peaks corresponding to the initial letter and the reminder letter. Well, sorry, it's a 3rd peak for the 2nd reminder. But we got this big peak at the first reminder. What am I doing? Because we were using something we picked up from ONS. The 2nd reminder letter had in text in bold in red, time is running out. And that got us that great peak, you know. The other thing it highlighted was the extent to which people were completing the online questionnaire using mobile or tablet, and you know, that's very useful information to have. In terms of the future of online data collection in Northern Ireland, our focus has been on, in using Ian O'Sullivan's terms, translating rather than transforming, moving our surveys into a new version of our software that gives us the capability of doing online. But I think we don't see us moving any of our surveys directly to online, but we may use online completion of things like self-completions or additional modules and so on. We do use online data collection for staff and organisational surveys, and most of our business surveys are already online, but using a somewhat dated system. But what we do is we're using the structure that was built for online data collection to communicate and data exchange with our interviewers, and that's opened up a lot of other possibilities. So, I mean, I have some concerns, as many people have. Sarah and I were at a conference earlier this year, and I picked up that quote from Mick Cooper from Michigan, that all surveys are too long. It doesn't matter what mode you do them in, they're all too long, and they need to be shortened. And Mick also claimed that he got, they had people in a longitudinal study in the US completing an online survey that lasted 2 hours. No. But I think it was because of the longitudinal survey and they were older people. There are mode effects, there are device effects. So there's a debate about should you design online questionnaires to suit mobile, because that's when most people will be completing them, or do you design it for the device that people are completing, so you make the best of the device rather than forcing everybody into the same approach. I think Ian O'Sullivan mentioned the potential impact on interviewers of push to web. Compliant people will do surveys no matter what mode you ask them to do them in, and then interviewers are left with a really difficult job of trying to convert people who don't really want to do surveys, so you're actually making their job harder. And the last point, I think, there's very little evidence of cost savings online, particularly if you take the development costs and spread them out over the period that you're doing it. I don't think it delivers the cost savings that people hope for. Here's a chart that when I first saw it, I said, oh, come on, you made that up. It's too good to be true. But what it is, it's 20 years of data from our continuous household survey. The red bars are those people who don't have access at home to the internet, and the green are those who do. So it's almost completely flipped in that 20 years. But the thing to note is that there's still about 15% of households in Northern Ireland who do not have access to the internet at home. They're mostly older people, and they're also mostly less affluent households. And also the mode of accessing the internet has changed quite a lot. So from about 2008 on, many more people accessing the internet via a mobile, and the discontinuity there for PCs because we didn't distinguish tablets from laptops until about 2014, 2015. So that's something, and I mean the other two things there that are increasing numbers of people accessing the internet via their TV or a games console. So that introduces a lot more issues. I'll just say something about household response rates since the previous section referred to that. I mean, we just have to accept, I think, that response rates are never going to go back to what they were. But they also have political context has an impact. And I couldn't resist showing you this. Because I sign most of the advance letters that go out, I have to deal with a lot of the office refusals that come back. And one day, this plain brown envelope landed on my desk, and I thought, what's that? I turned it over, and written was that. I then opened it up, and out fell a neatly torn up LFS advance letter. I think that person was angry about something. But it does, I mean, the fact that we don't have a government at the moment takes away one of our best selling points. You can know, interviewers can't go to the door and say, well, this is really important information. Government makes lots of decisions on this. You can imagine the response you get.
I can tell you that doesn't improve by having a government.
That's true. Those are the sort of historical wave one LFS response rates. So the brown line, we dropped below 50% in 2018 for the first time, and that's a point of concern. So what have we done in the years since that? We've managed to add 10 percentage points to the response rate on the LFS, taking it from 50% up to 60%. So what have we been doing? Those are the sorts of things that we think are having an impact. And we haven't been able to do well-designed studies to determine what the impact is. We're more concerned about just getting the response rates up. But you'll notice that most of the things that we've been doing have been concentrating on interviewers. Now, except the ONS respondent-orientated approach, yes, but we think this has been effective. So lots of feedback, lots of specific briefings for interviewers. We have developed what we call achieving cooperation training, which is giving interviewers positive ways of dealing with people on the doorstep, and also ways of making an exit before you get a refusal. And that's quite a skill. We've done some work on incentives, not finished yet, but it looks like unconditional financial incentives are being more effective than conditional ones. I just want to finish with some reflection on where we think future developments for us will be going. One of the things is, I mentioned the NISRA address register, which has really been developed by our census colleagues based on, well, it's an address database that was used for collection of rates. None of you people remember rates. We still have them here in Northern Ireland. But what they've done is they've linked that address database to the path and also to administrative sources, looking for what we call signs of life. So what we really like, but we can't get, is if the household has an active electricity, if the meter's turning on the electricity account, that would be a real sign of life. But what they have done is link it to things like, have they had a visit to a GP, dentist, some of the health events. They give each address a score where 0 suggests there probably isn't a building there, or if there is, nobody's living in it, up to 10, which means it's highly likely that somebody's living there. So we're using that at the moment to remove those addresses that it suggests that it's highly unlikely that there's anybody living there. So that saves a lot in terms of paperwork efficiency. And we give our colleagues feedback on that so that they can improve their modelling. Our fieldwork processes, again, we're trying to learn from the work that ONS clients are doing and sort of sharpen up our letters and so on. And we've also reviewed some of our survey names and changed them, so we no longer have a crime survey, we have a safer community survey, because crime doesn't get you much response on doorsteps. We're thinking about giving interviewers NISRA branding, and there's a wider work going on to try and improve NISRA's brand recognition, as it were. We're also working with customers to try and reduce the length of our questionnaires, and we've had some success there. And we're training use of financial incentives on the LFS. And just to finish, a couple of sort of pie in the sky future developments. We need to change our pay model for our interviewers in a way that incentivizes them to do the things that we want them to do and not the things that they want to do. Andrew's working towards a CSU app for completion of surveys. We need to develop a case management system that has multi-mode capability. GPS, our census colleagues already have the makings of a system that will allow interviewers to pull up Google Maps, Street View, and also our Land and Property Services colleagues do an aerial survey of Northern Ireland updated every year, so they can get aerial picture views of where they are to help them find addresses. More controversial, I think, is using GPS for quality control, but we really want to do that. Even if it's just telling the interviewer, I don't think you're at the right address. But we can pick up GPS in the questionnaires, and well, there are legal implications there that we're trying to sort out. And the system we're using at the moment produces a fantastic audit trail, keystroke by keystroke. So in terms of understanding what's going on within a questionnaire, you can look at exactly what's happening, how long each question takes, when the interviewer backspaces and corrects things. And Andrew's just had shared from University of Michigan a system that allows us to look at that and use it in a fairly straightforward way. And well, one of its first uses is, should an interviewer accidentally delete an interview, we can recreate the interview from the audit trail, because every keystroke is recorded, and I think that's got great power. And I think that's all that I was going to cover.
I might stand up. Peter Fullerton, I'm from the Data Science Campus, but don't boo, I used to be head of social survey already. So I confess to all offences in this field. A couple of points we discussed. One thing we found out at ASCO, integrated household survey going back, is discontinuities. The labour force survey, the main source of the UK unemployment estimate. So quite difficult to be very transformative without creating a discontinuity in your results. I don't know if in the countries you found that. The other is my current experience with data science. What I would like to see is surveys giving us a much better idea of, for example, what subpopulation is using social media and other aspects of their sort of digital presence to better interpret other sources. And conversely, using data science approaches to improve surveys. We're working with a living costs and food survey at the moment, looking at natural language processing on receipts. And with an example about electricity in houses, or you could look at heat coming from houses, you could use data science, satellite images, LiDAR images, whatever, to analyse that. So I think there's opportunities for data science using big data to help with surveys, and for surveys to help interpret big data sources.
So, big one to start with. Anyone got something smaller?
I think we were discussing whether changes in household structure and how people live might have impacted on the kind of questions that are asked and the ability for people to answer them. I don't know. People live apart together now. Does that mean are the questions that are asked in the questionnaire sometimes not right for certain settings.
Yeah.
So,
Particularly for longitudinal surveys, we are finding that. And how do you follow split families through several generations? It's a big challenge.
The speakers have all talked about their devolved surveys. Do any of them use surveys that go right across the UK as comparisons or benchmarks? Is that relevant? Things like labour force survey and so on.
Yeah. I mean, we use the labour force survey in particular. We get separate Northern Ireland data, but we use the UK data as our reference point. Yeah.
And you calibrate against that in some sense to look for similar changes, or of course it will have a smaller sample size. But
Question: do you calibrate against it? Do you compare your estimates with?
No, we compare our estimates with the UK, but then the labour market in Northern Ireland is very different from the rest of the UK, so we have to take that into account as well.
I guess in Wales we use a lot of UK surveys as our source of information, so the labour force survey, survey of earnings, things like that. That's where we get our data. What we do in a number of other things, both in terms of UK, well, more England surveys, but also some international surveys like European Social Survey, is we use those as a source of questions. So we can at least make some comparison about things like social cohesion with other parts of the UK or internationally, even though they're not directly comparable. At least it gives us some idea.
Any more questions or reactions?
Not to drum on at the same beat, but in Wales I was wondering, whenever you were assessing integrating surveys, did you look at any administrative data sources that you could have been putting into either replace questions or to augment them?
Not particularly, given all the surveys we ask are basically saying, what's your view on this? Subjective questions, sport questions, participation, they aren't the sorts of things that are in administrative surveys. Although we are looking for certain things. Recently we used the new national survey as a sample frame for a housing condition survey, and we added a few specific questions to support that, one of which was income. We don't like doing that because it impacts on response rate, and the interviewers don't like asking it. So the next time we would do a housing condition survey, which will probably be around every 4 or 5 years, we're going to be looking at using admin data for that rather than actually asking a question. And that could be across a range of things where we want to put something in there that isn't the kind of the more subjective type measures. We'd certainly be looking at admin data rather than trying to ask a whole series of complicated questions, which fills up survey time and potentially hits response rates.
So we in Scotland just started looking at whether we can replace income and benefit data, which we get a lot of errors and people not knowing in our surveys with admin data. So we're just starting to look at that at the moment.
We haven't done anything.
So my first experience of statistics was sitting in the car waiting for my mum to finish her job as a labour force survey field worker in Dublin in the 1980s. And she's just messaging me now about her experience of that. Hi, Mum. She's like, I always got great cooperation when they were in.
That's the trick, isn't it?
But it was one of the comments in terms of incentivisation of field workers and getting responses, and when they're going to very rural areas where travel times for field workers between houses that they might be sampling versus travel times within a city, and how that perverse incentivisation can really affect field workers and things, thinking about that. But then there was also, her most challenging area was Rathgar in Dublin, when there was lots of houses as bedsits that weren't officially labelled as bedsits, and trying to track down people in there. So
I'm going to use the chess prerogative on that one. Yes, I mean, so we have a number of islands in Scotland, right? Which weirdly one would think interviewers don't like going to, because we're talking about multiple ferries to get to them. I'm looking at some of our field work stuff here. However, once they get there, right, they get invited in. That's when they want to interview the neighbours 2 islands further down, and they get asked to stay for dinner. So on the other hand, a similar interview in Glasgow, securing that is a totally different kettle of fish. So you have your pros and cons either way. And I think the other thing that we perversely need to make sure that we don't incentivise is for interviews to falsify that. To get a door slammed in their face, sit in the car and make it up. That does unfortunately happen as well. And how do you not incentivise people to start being less truthful or a little faster with the script?
And I think that's what I was referring to when we're looking at a model that doesn't incentivise driving around, but does incentivise interviewing. No, it's very difficult to do that and come up with something that still works.
Well, thank you very much, advisors. We are just about out of time. I would like to invite you on your way out, in your pairs, newly found or otherwise, to leave us some advice of things that we should start doing, ideas that you have that you would like us to look at. We'll also be milling about, speak to us, things that we should stop or drop, and things that you think we should continue working on. There's a wall with the file back on the right side where you can pin your ideas on. You should all be in the vicinity of some of these labels. Feel free to use different colours if you don't have them to hand. And we also have a beautiful display by NISRA of the type of computers that they have been using for the last, maybe 40 years to assist them with their interviews. So thank you very, very much to our 3 speakers for giving up their time, writing such brilliant talks and bringing in all the equipment as well. Thank you.